Thank you all so much for joining us for our second Critical Conversation. Critical Conversations is a quarterly lecture series hosted by the Decorative Arts Trust. Through this series, we hope to address issues facing the decorative arts community to foster meaningful dialogue and impactful change. The Trust is also pleased to announce a new Ideal Internship Initiative as part of our growing Emerging Scholars program. Ideal internships are focused on inclusivity, diversity, equity, access, and leadership. The Trust is eager to engage with this conversation by improving access to curatorial careers and offering solutions to achieve systematic change. We are providing grants to museums and historic sites to build toward a more inclusive future, achieved by creating opportunities for students of color interested in joining this field. The Trust will provide $20,000 for summer and academic year internships for high school and undergraduate students beginning in 2021. The deadline to submit proposals is December 31st, and I encourage everyone to find additional information on this amazing opportunity. There is a link in the chat, and you will also find information on the Ideal Internship Grant on our website. I am Carrie, the Programming Coordinator for the Decorative Arts Trust, and I am just here today to make sure that the tech runs smoothly. The star of our program is Moderator Monique Johnson. Monique Johnson is a native Louisianan, a history buff and proud mother of two. Johnson holds a BA and an MA in history from Southeastern Louisiana University and specializes in Louisiana's Afro-Creole populations with an emphasis on race and gender relations in colonial and antebellum Louisiana. She has held a variety of positions at cultural institutions across South Louisiana. I hope you all take the time to read her article, How Not to Run a Plantation Museum. And without further ado, I turn the digital lectern over to Monique. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Hi. Well, today we are sharing a conversation on inclusive narratives at historic house museums. This is an important conversation to fix past and accurate historical interpretations and develop methods to accurately integrate historical presentations. I thought carefully about these questions, and I hope you find the conversation to be engaging and useful. Now, I'd like to take a moment to let each of the panelists introduce themselves and their institutions. Though each from sites that center around our future historic houses, these panelists come from vastly different institutions and were selected based on their professional experience and institutional objectives. Let's start off with an introduction from Rodneyna Hart, Division Director at Louisiana State Museum.
Hello, everyone. Just as Monique said, my name is Rodneyna Hart. I'm the Division Director, which means that I'm over all of the non-New Orleans state museums. So there, I can talk a little bit about all of our spaces. So I'm gonna share my screen, if that's okay with you guys. Share screen, sharing that one, share. All right, so that's me, and generally the topic that we're covering today. So I thought I'd start with our mission. The mission of the Office of State Museums is to collect, preserve, and present as an educational resource objects of art, documents, artifacts, and the like that reflect the history, art, and culture of Louisiana for the citizens and visitors to the state of Louisiana. So it's a pretty standard mission, but it covers quite a few institutions. So the Louisiana State Museum is a system of museums. There are 9 total. 8 of them are open to the public at the moment, and they span the entire state. So 2 of the house museums in the system are in New Orleans. We've got the 1850 house and Madam John's Legacy. The 1850 house, it really features a lot of traditional house museum elements with period furniture, highlights and interpretation But one of the really innovative things that we've been able to do is create a soundscape that really talks to the experience that people have in that space. Another at Madam John's Legacy, which is closed for repair at the moment. But we're viewing this as a wonderful opportunity to completely overhaul the interpretation, to figure out what can we do to make this a more user-friendly, community-centered space and understand that narrative in an important way. So as I said, I'm the division director, so I'm over all of the non-New Orleans museums. So that's the museums in Patterson and in Natchitoches. I'm going to talk less about because they're not historic houses, but they are wonderful museums, and if you get an opportunity, you should totally check them out. But E.D. White Historic Site is a plantation home that was owned by Edward Douglas White, who was a governor, and then later was run by his son, who was a Supreme Court justice. There we focus on the family and the surrounding area, the industry of sugar plantations. But then we also have an acknowledgement of the Native American and African population who both kind of maintain that space. Another space that I am very involved with is the Capitol Park Museum. And here we talk about the life, the culture, and different representations of time within Louisiana citizens throughout the state. So it's a really diverse and rich exhibition, and our interpretation themes carry throughout the entire system.
Awesome, thank you so much. Our next panelist is going to be Rob Fields, President and Executive Director, Weeksville Heritage Center.
Good morning, everyone. Let me also try and be as deft as Rodneyna and see if I can actually share my screen here. Here we go, share that, and slideshow. This interview. Hey, oh, well, close enough.
Okay.
Anyway, yeah, let's try one more time and just do slideshow, play from current. There we go, yes. So anyway, good morning. So I've been told 3 minutes, so this is going to be a quick overview of Weeksville. Weeksville is a historic house site and cultural center, and the majority of our work really involves making the history of what was one of the largest free Black communities in pre-Civil War America relevant and resonant to contemporary audiences. Weeksville as a community was founded in 1838 by James Weeks and a group of Black investors. They bought land from the Lefferts family, the Lefferts, the Garretsons. They were some of the large Dutch landowning families. And it was with that sale of land that they were able to begin inviting others to buy the land. They subdivided the land and advertised it in the growing network of Black newspapers that, hey, we are building this intentional community. And so by 1850, 1855, Weeksville swells to about 500 people. They had some higher profile people, activist Henry Highland Garnett, who was very much involved in the abolition movement. Dr. Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, who was the first Black woman doctor in New York State, the third in the nation, came out of Weeksville. Weeksville had its own baseball team in the 1860s. Weeksville published its own newspaper, which actually functioned in two ways. It was both a news organ and it was a teaching tool. You'll see here one of the few reproductions that we have from 1866. There's alphabets and Bible sayings on here, but that's because it was a teaching tool for the members of the community who were formerly enslaved, because Weeksville was a stop on the Underground Railroad. So the newspaper formed, did a couple of different things other than, in addition to its role as an editorial sort of like news of the day kind of vehicle. Weeksville sort of disappears by the 30s with the consolidation of Brooklyn. Brooklyn becomes one Brooklyn. The boundary lines of Weeksville are sort of absorbed into New Brooklyn. And it wasn't until the late 60s when the historic houses were found in much disrepair by Jim Hurley and Joan Maynard, and that started a whole community-wide effort to reclaim and show that there were actually historic and there was historic value in the site. All this community archaeological work was able to be something that the community took to the New York City Landmarks Commission and got the historic houses landmarked. And they finally were able to, after many years of renovations, open to the public in 2005. And we used them to do tours and tell the history of, this historic community. I just love this picture of our founding executive director by Randy Duchesne. This is Joan Maynard in our 1900s house. These are the houses today restored. This last house on the all the way on the left is actually not an original house anymore because it burned down in an electrical fire in the 80s and was restored. But these are two of the three houses. This is the one in the middle is our 1860s sort of double house. The one on the right is our 1900s house. And then there's one that's not in the frame that was what we call our 1930s house. And that actually had people living in it when it was rediscovered in the late 60s. Today, Weeksville Heritage Center encompasses both the historic houses and this brand new 23,000 square foot visitor and cultural center that was the construction of which was completed in 2014. And it allows us to do all kinds of, programs, across arts and culture and presentation. Here's a quick flavor of some of the programs we've done and continue to do. Weeksville is a site of Black history, Black culture, Black creativity, and it's a convening space. And we use this history of this historic town and this community and the themes that sort of animated it to sort of tell this history and engage contemporary audiences today. So, and here's some social links for us. So I think that's 3 minutes. So, and I'm gonna stop sharing. There you go.
Awesome, thank you so much. Our next panelist is going to be Dr. Susan Schoelwer, PhD, Executive Director of Historic Preservation and Collections, and Robert H. Smith, Senior Curator at George Washington, Mount Vernon. Take it away.
Thank you, Monique. I'm very glad to be here this afternoon, and I too have images to share. Oh dear. Oh, they've disappeared. Okay, okay. Windows. Okay, I absolutely don't know what has happened. Let me start talking in any case. You all know Mount Vernon as George Washington's home, and that it indeed is. But it is also home to more than 500 enslaved people who lived here during George Washington's time. And the site itself is much more than the mansion. It is, we have 45 acres of the home farm, which include, let me try one more time. Oh, here we go. There we go. Okay, so George Washington's Mount Vernon, 500 enslaved people. You see the names of those who are recorded in Washington's 1799 census. And you see George Washington's bust in the entrance to our current exhibition through the names of those enslaved people. The site is much more than the mansion, 45 acres of the home farm, with 15 original outbuildings, kitchen, wash house, smokehouse, stable, storehouse, garden house, plus other buildings that have been reconstructed on the basis of documentary and archaeological evidence. Greenhouse and slave quarter, slave cabin, blacksmith shop, barn, grist mill, and distillery. As I mentioned, we have a census of 317 enslaved men, women, and children who lived here on the estate in 1799. And you see the infographic in the lower right, those blue figures in contrast to about 20 white hired and indentured workers and 5 members of the Washington family. So I think when you put that graphic in your mind against the aerial view of the estate, it gives you a very different feel for a different sense of what the estate was like in 1799. We have a lot of resources for studying the experience and understanding the experience of those enslaved people. The findings of 35 years of systematic archaeological excavations of sites associated with slavery. We have extensive, and that archaeological material tells us a lot about the physical living conditions, the foodways, and so forth. Because of George Washington's extraordinary attention to the nitty-gritty details of plantation management, we have really rich information about the lives of enslaved individuals, down to the level of who was doing what job for how many hours on a given summer day. This is the central document, kind of our Rosetta Stone. It's a census that Washington compiled in 1799. And he lists both the slaves that the enslaved people he owned that were owned by the Custis estate, their names, ages if he knew them, their skill or job assignment, family relationships, and in some cases, physical conditions. And this document enables us to link those names when they come up in other references. And here's an example of the farm report with that kind of level of detail of the work being done in specific fields. So building on, drawing out that documentation for our current exhibition, Lives Bound Together, we were able to identify 17 individuals whose lives we thought we could present in some detail. So their lives are suggested by figures of silhouettes and then by interactives that allow people to dig deeper into what we know about them. For instance, family relationships, where they lived on George Washington's 5 farms, tracing those family relationships really over potentially 2 or 3 generations. And this exhibition, which we began planning in 2013, opened in 2016, has really been the catalyst to bring together a lot of this primary research and make it accessible in a very public way. Of particular value, I think, has been the ability to talk about slavery through the stories of these individual lives rather than rather faceless statistics. So that's a brief introduction. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. And last but not least, it's going to be Carrie Villar, the John and Neville Bryan Associate Director of Museum Collections, National Trust for Historic Preservations.
Thank you. And I'm going to share as well. Let's see, make sure it works. And after hearing all of the great introductions, I know we're all eager to get the conversation started. So my intro will be quick so we can get talking. But I am with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We have a nationwide portfolio of historic sites that represent over 400 years of human history. We have 27 open to the public. You can see our stats here, just over 300 structures, 4,000 acres, the objects and archaeological artifacts. And we use all of those to continually reimagine how we interpret our sites for the public. You can see here, we have a Louisiana site, Shadows on the Teche in New Iberia. So I look forward to talking more with Monique and Rodneyna about our work there as we're rethinking our interpretation of the shadows. But we also have a number of sites with a history of enslavement, ranging from Rhode Island down to Louisiana. So we are, actively engaged as a portfolio, working together for sites. Some like larger sites like Montpelier, like James Madison's Montpelier, are farther ahead in the work, and other smaller sites like Woodlawn, which is just right down the street from Mount Vernon, is just in the beginning stages of that reinterpretation. So my role is overseeing the museum collections, which we said 60,000 objects. We also include our historic landscapes and our buildings in the collection. On just one side of the coin, I'm part of a technical services team that works from National Trust headquarters to provide guidance and oversight to our sites across the country. And one of my colleagues, Elon Cook-Lee, she is our Director of Interpretation and Education, and she's currently working with our Sites of Enslavement working group that we formed for later this week. Actually, this is sort of our breaking news. We're holding a symposium to discuss the issues related to holding weddings and other celebratory events at plantations. So that's some of the latest work that we're doing there. So more to come on that. And happy to leave with you with my email address, happy to connect you to any of our sites or any of my other colleagues if you're so interested. So thank you.
Thank you so much. You piqued my interest with the weddings at plantations. Since South Louisiana, that is a thing, and people are like, it's no problem. It's cool. So we're gonna get down to the questions. Question 1, who or what controls the historical interpretation and tours at your site? How has this interpretation changed over time? If so, how?
I'm happy to let Susan sort of
Yeah.
start lead off on that one.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't unmuted. Mount Vernon has a long history going back to the beginning of its preservation in 1860. So obviously there's been a lot of change. I would say a gradual expansion of interpretation of slavery and the enslaved people. And that control has really shifted over time from the board to the professional staff as professional staff grew, because at the very beginning, there was no one besides the board. And so I think we do still have a very active board, and at various points, they have been key figures in that interpretation. The reason we have those outbuildings that I mentioned, for example, is because our founder, Ann Pamela Cunningham, ignored professional advice at the time that said, don't bother with anything but the mansion. No one's ever going to care. And she said, no, my goal is to preserve preserve Mount Vernon as Washington knew it. And that means everything. And so that really started us on the path where we do have these resources that we can turn to now. I would say that many of the initiatives in the recent period have been largely staff driven. For example, Lives Bound Together stemmed from a brainstorming session in 2013, where all of our content staff, I hate that term, but there it is, really agreed that, people were asking about slavery. We had a lot of resources, and we felt that we could tell a distinctive story, drilling down to those individual lives. And so that was really the catalyst toward the exhibition. Rob?
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Yeah, our interpretations have been the same since about 2009, and part of that is our interpretations are tied to our tours. And so we use these sort of traditional interpretations in each of the houses to take us through 3 different eras that highlight historic Weeksville, sort of like that 1860s kind of period when Weeksville is established, but slavery is still in existence in the South. Weeksville is a stop on the Underground Railroad. The middle house is kind of 1900s, where the family that lived there has a bit more means, and they're moving towards kind of middle class lives. The 1930s house lets us talk about sort of the decline of the community known as Weeksville, and bridges us into kind of the rediscovery in present day. Those interpretations haven't changed. The question for me was, when I got there 3 years ago, was really about how do we get people back once they've seen these traditional interpretations, like what gets you back? And so we had the fortune of still using a part of the 1860s double house, which is, it's one house with the two exact of the same sides, and one part of that building got used for an artistic interpretation for a project we did with Creative Time. And so I started to use that space as sort of an artist in residency space, just as a way to, one, engage contemporary artists who were going to leverage some of Weeksville's history and themes as a way to use it as an exhibit space, and that would then start bringing people back to the house, and also maybe attract some new people who might not think of themselves as, oh, I'm interested in historic houses, but would come to see the artists. And so that's basically how our houses function. And we have tour educators who lead the tours. It is basically the same script, because that's where, again, we can talk about the history of Weeksville through a walking tour of the houses. Obviously, we're not doing that right now, but yeah, things haven't changed, because that's kind of the heart of the Weeksville story. And everything else we do from a cultural presenter standpoint sort of flows from that direct connection to the houses, or themes inspired by the houses and what they represent. So.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. I love how it's two very different topics that you're discussing and just how you interpret. It's very interesting. We're going to go to our next question. Can you tell us about how you integrate and balance the narratives of historically oppressed peoples and the more traditional narratives associated with your site?
Sure. So one of the things that we do, and I'm sure all of us as contemporary cultural institutions, is that we have a comprehensive interpretation, and we avoid lip service of certain initiatives that are going on, and instead are actively trying to decolonize or decentralize a white male voice in our interpretation. We want to give real agency to everyone who's lived in the house and everyone who has created this sustainable enterprise. So one way that we've been able to do that is to have a comprehensive interpretation. We're not vilifying any of the homeowners or the people who existed in history, but we're also not glorifying a false narrative. It's very important that we are speaking truth and giving light to history in an authentic way. Something that acknowledges enslavement, acknowledges the original founders of that land, the indigenous population, and it needs to be comprehensive. And we at each of our sites go about it in a very similar way. How can we make our exhibitions relevant to our communities, make them inspirational and aspirational? And by giving these true stories of these living people and through multimedia, sometimes it's just interpretation of objects, sometimes it's visual, sometimes it's audio visual, but we try to make the people live and you to really experience what life was like for them and why they're worth celebrating now.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think one of the challenges some of our National Trust sites face is that we don't have those separate exhibition spaces. So the primary experience that visitors get is through the guided tour. And while we're working on shifting that experience, we still, one of the things that is key is getting the narratives that you need to tell within that 45 minutes and making it make sense. So you're not alienating your visitor by just confusing them outright, giving them a sense of time and context within that 45 minutes is a challenge. And so we do it on the regular tour. We offer some specialty tours, but it's also key to make it part of the enter the door experience and not have it be an optional add-on. It really, the oppressed narratives need to be something that everyone, understands the importance of learning about them. We're also trying to make connections with contemporary art, just as Rob mentioned, bringing in contemporary artists to do their interpretations and having various workshops and exhibits, and we have space for them. And also it's easy with a traditional narrative because you often have so much documentary evidence. So just taking the time to acknowledge that we don't know the answers to these questions, but we're asking these questions and we're trying to fill in the gaps of these people's lives.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're going to move on to our next question. What are the complexities of preserving and honoring a historic site while building a community?
I think that part of the challenge, as I alluded to earlier, is about relevance. And again, I mean, we live in a country that, at least from my perspective, has made history this boring thing. It's like you go through school and you've got to quickly learn these dates because you're going to have a test on it. And we're not really shown how, until much later, college or maybe later, how history kind of influences and impacts, how we're living today. And I think that's just true broadly. I think people who work in museum spaces certainly see those connections and understand those connections. But I think the general public has this sort of sense that like, this is going to be boring. I need to go to a historic house site, for something that happened 100 years ago. But the thing that I like to focus on is that once you get people in the door, the trick is relevance, trying to get people in the door so that they can be exposed to it. Because the thing is, this history, particularly history of Black people in Brooklyn in America, has to be keep being retaught every year because successive generations need to learn it, right? Because it's not sort of codified in academic curriculum and lower grades, so I'm grateful that we're not just a historic site with, the houses alone. I think, we've really had to make the houses sort of like the animating force, but we also know that having great programs that just get people into the space so they can hear a little bit, be intrigued, maybe come back during the day for a tour when we offer tours is kind of the way that we have to build and re-engage with community. And I think part of it is through like our public programs, very much sort of, doing things that are relevant, resonant for people, bringing contemporary arts. And, we do everything from, we had a literary series because Weeksville has a history of literacy. We've had, an outdoor concert series that was based on, the ways that in historic Weeksville would sort of, folks would relax and enjoy. They would have garden parties. So we had a garden party series. And it wasn't anything where people were in historic costumes or anything. We had contemporary artists, Toshi Reagan and Michelle Ndegeocello and all kinds of folks. But it was but the research that went into that to sort of create a framework for that often unseen by most people, was still part of the genesis of that program. And so that's how we connect the historical to things that people would find more relevant immediately. And once you get people in the door, you can have a conversation about what is Weeksville, what is the George Washington House, what are, you know, some of these National Historic Trust sites. But it's like, you got to get people in the door to engage them, because most people who even live in the neighborhood are like, oh, I don't even know what this place is. So there are several hurdles as we begin to build community. One, get people in, and two, then it's like, let them provide opportunities for them to learn about the history, and more importantly, I would say, just to have a great sort of affirming experience in your space. And then they'll want to come back, because again, ours is a place that, you know, in a changing, gentrifying central Brooklyn, where we center Black history, Black culture, you know, Black creativity. And I think people feel that, particularly the Black folks in central Brooklyn, because we're right across the street from a housing project. You know, I think they feel the welcome once they cross the threshold, and they're like, oh, didn't know what this was, but now I do. So that's been our challenge, to balance the history and contemporary sort of vibe, so that you get people engaged with the overall work of what you have to do. And I think in some ways our challenge is harder, because we're not one thing, you know, and sometimes I wish we were just a historic house, because then you could be super focused. But, you know,
one thing that so since we do have so many institutions, I'll mostly talk about the E.D. White Historic Site. One initiative that we've done is we found not people who would necessarily be interested in the museum, but why would we be interested in these community organizations?
mm-hmm.
So we're establishing new connections through the community, and letting them know that, hey, there's something here for you. For instance, we've reached out to the local high school. There's an E.D. White Catholic high school that is in Thibodeau. And we've invited the school to come, and it's a free field trip for them. They used to have a tradition of taking photographs in front of the site every year, and have reopened the door to that kind of opportunity. We've also reached out to people who are painters or photographers, and said, this is a wonderful site for plein air painting. Maybe you'd love to check out the beautiful oaks. We have also we've reached out to the Jean Lafitte National Historical Parks and Preserve Wetlands in Acadiana. We've started partnering with their tour of the area. So now they ride a boat up Bayou Lafourche. And when they get to the E.D. White Landing, they can come out and explore the home and the grounds. We have a new kitchen that is a pretty big deal. And we've done tours where you can have chicory coffee and cornbread. You know, it's establishing this older model of, yes, we are a historic home, but there's something relevant to you in this site. And we're building a lot of our community from scratch. The space has been available, has been seen. There are other houses on that road that are not public museum spaces that are more opulent, that are more visually attractive. So what do we have that is unique? And that is our oaks. It is the history of the site. And also we're including a lot more of the interpretation of the Chitimacha tribe, who were the indigenous people of that space. We are reaching out to them and getting the kinds of activities that we have to offer approved. And also we're able to do different programs with them on this site. And we're also, you know, we've got those stoic history buffs who want to do reenactments and things. And I am always pro canon. So if you want to bring a canon and do something cool, I mean, I'm not going to turn you away. But, you know, we try to be very selective, and we talk to the groups and make sure that what they want to do, it is relevant to our mission, but also that it's not steeped in racism, because that's really
Awesome.
also a thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, we are running out of time. I'm going to go run to question number 4. What impact has heritage tourism had on your institution and the tourism market?
Well, I think for Mount Vernon, heritage tourism is our bread and butter. George Washington remains at the core of what we do, but people tell us they're coming because they're interested in Washington, they're interested in American history generally, they're interested in architecture, gardens, furnishings, all those material culture sorts of things that we do, but they also tell us that they are interested in slavery. And the history of the enslaved at the site. And I think that, you know, people may be coming primarily to look for Washington or the American history experience, the founding fathers generally, but the fact that we do have a strong interpretation, an opportunity to explore the lives of the enslaved, it offers the possibility to people who may not thought that they were interested in the history of the enslaved, or who may have been sort of afraid to ask questions. And so we do see comments from people, for example, visitors to the exhibition, that tell us that this was their first in-depth kind of encounter with the history of the enslaved, and that it opened a door for them. And I think, you know, sort of to Rob's point, getting people in the door, making that initial connection so that they can build on that is really very important.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think one of the interesting things about the last 10 months or so of the pandemic is that we've seen, going from the sites that can open, going from a regional, national, international audience to a sort of a hyper local, of people looking around to see what's in their own backyards and to learn about their local history. And I think what almost more than the people that come to the site, I'm interested in the people who don't come. And for example, down at the Shadows in New Iberia, you know, the New Iberia is probably over 50% African American for residents, and you know, getting feedback from the community of why they don't cross the threshold of the Shadows, of, you know, if African Americans were mentioned at all, it was a story of pain, and that's not how they want to spend their Saturday. So it's very interesting to not just talk to the people who are already coming, but also talk to the people who don't want to come to find out why.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Dr. Schoelwer, I want to come to Mount Vernon because once the pandemic is over, because of that. So yes, you have my interest. And also, Carrie, yes, it's a very interesting thing to hear African-American in South Louisiana. Like, I don't want to go to a plantation. This is awkward. This is weird. I've been to lots of plantations in Louisiana, and you'll hear stuff, disturbance and da-ba-da, and you know, it makes you feel very awkward and weird and is not comfortable. And I'm just going because I'm a history buff, but yeah, it's, and you know, my family is all from Plantation Alley, and it's like, why don't you talk about this? Because we don't talk about it, you know. So yes. Okay, moving on. We're going to have to jump to our last and final question, you guys. Question number 9. So sorry, I had to skip around to run out of time. Our final question is going to be, a lot of our conversation today has been focused on balance and space. To close our conversation, I'd like to ask each panelist, what do they feel the biggest challenge for museums and historic sites are when integrating narratives of oppressed peoples?
So honestly, the most difficult thing for us is finding the narratives. It is, there's a difference between a forgotten legacy and one that's purposely been snuffed out. In the South, maintaining the records, having literate people who could share stories, having sympathetic white people who wanted to maintain these stories, it is always a challenge. So whenever we do find information, we put it on a pedestal. We try to elevate these voices. And then also unlearning these narratives of things being centered in white, straight maleness. And that these stories of people of color, stories of women, LGBTQ individuals, that they're germane to history. This is not an additional type of interpretation. This is history as it was lived. And so it would be unethical for us to share uh, the life of the people who inhabited this home without speaking about the breath of life that existed in the space and maintained it.
Uh, Susan, you can go if you, I saw you on.
Okay, I would say that, this is the moment when Mount Vernon has a different problem than most historic houses, because in a non-COVID period, we're seeing 1.1 million visitors a year. And that means that on a peak day in the spring, when we have lots of school groups, people are only getting 15 minutes in the mansion. And so that challenge is time to balance all the things you want to do, to balance talking about what they're seeing. They come to learn about George Washington, but we want to also talk about the enslaved. We want to talk about Martha Washington and the women who lived in the house, and to pack that all into perhaps a 15 to 18-minute experience is difficult. One of the things that our interpreters do now is that when people are going on a mansion tour, the interpreters are expected to mention the name by name, one of the enslaved in each room or each interpreted space in the mansion, as a way of making that often invisible, unacknowledged presence visible, or at least audible, to just get that on people's radar screen.
Yeah, I think my comment is connected to that. It's you can spend a career, you can spend a lifetime researching the nuances of all of the stories of a site and getting that across to the public in a way that still embraces the art of storytelling, and a good tour experience or exhibition experience is very challenging. And thinking about that 15 to 18 minutes that you have to cram everything in, I'm just thinking out loud here of whether we need more conversations of what of the traditional narrative gets dropped. I'm thinking it's not our site, the Farnsworth House in outside Chicago this year did a reinstallation where they totally reinstalled the house to tell the Edith Farnsworth story, because the woman who built the house, her story was always an afterthought. So now she's the primary narrative, and maybe it's time to set some of the traditional narratives aside and not include them on the standard tour. I don't know, I'm just throwing that out there.
I think one of the privileges that Weeksville has is that the Weeksville story, unlike a lot of museums that have to sort of deal with this history of oppression, the Weeksville story is one of ascension. It is one of, Black people came together to intentionally build a community, and they built institutions. 3 churches, in fact, that still exist to this day, came out of historic Weeksville. So that's the burden we don't have of when we talk about Weeksville, because it was something that was built by Black people for Black people, and it is largely maintained by Black people. The challenge, though, is again a lot of relevance and trying to think about new ways to engage people around this history, so they don't feel like a boring history lesson. But the thing that I'm finding and I found over these last 3 years is, once you go through the history and tell people the history of that to a person, Black, white, yellow, brown, purple, other, they're like, that is so fascinating, because it's one of those rabbit holes, kind of like, I just, and this is probably true for all of you in your various areas, but the history of your city is a total rabbit hole, and you can just go down that. And I'm sure that's true wherever you live. And so New York City history is just like, oh my God, we didn't know, people didn't know that. And I think that it is one of those things that when you learn the history of Weeksville and you connect it to other things that were going on, the draft riots and, the history of Weeksville's, as a slaveholding state till 1827. And then you look at what these Black people did, it fills an important part of New York City history. It fills an important part of American history, because the truth is there are towns like Weeksville all over the country where Black people were just trying to go, be, live, thrive, and fulfill the American promise. So I think our challenge now is just to, get more people to the site, to share that history. And for us, part of that has been about building infrastructure in the institution so that we can do the work and fulfill the mission that has been set out. And so we are finally, after about a decade of what I call struggle, finally able to, actually like hiring people to actually do the work. Like we'll be bringing on a VP of programs to give programmatic cohesion. We're thinking, in sometime in the new year, trying to bring on a program, a research director. Thanks to a partnership with the National Trust, we brought on a preservation manager to actually think about preserving those historic structures, because the earth reclaims everything if you leave it alone, and that's true for any house, the houses we all live in. So to be able to add that kind of expertise to the Weeksville staff to fulfill the mission that is now laid out in a brand new strategic plan, I think that's going to help us be able to continue to tell this story, because as you talk about Weeksville, people are like, wow, tell me more. So we're lucky in that regard, that it's an unknown story that as it gets revealed to people, they're drawn in, they want to learn more. And kudos to my staff for providing such a great overall visitor experience for this site, and as we all are as stewards of this history. So I'm kind of in a slightly different position, but I do know that there are many museums and sites who are struggling with that, and I shouldn't say struggle, they're grappling with how to move forward to be more inclusive in their stories. This is the moment that we're in, and I think it's long overdue, and it's great to see these conversations happening amongst our colleagues at mainstream white institutions that are really honestly trying to deal with this history and make interpretations that speak to the lived history of everyone who, as somebody said on this call, who made that site, those sites what they are. So.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. That was everybody that, oh yeah, next time I go to New York, yeah, some great places to go to. We're gonna take a couple of Q&A questions from our viewers. The first one is going to be, there are a couple, sorry. Wait a minute. How have you dealt with retraining volunteers and new interpretation tours, and what has been the reaction? That was from Rachel Rabinowitz. I'm so sorry if I said your name wrong.
We actually don't have, we don't have volunteers as yet doing tours. Those are our tour educators who have to learn a script. I even had to learn the script, and I learned it by reading the books and the script, and watching my tour educators who knew a whole lot more than me when I got there. But you just got to learn to give the story, and it is not something that we farm out to people yet, because we don't have anyone overseeing a volunteer corps yet who we could rightly trust that to. I mean, you need somebody to sort of wrangle and sort of do volunteer engagement before I think you can do that. So in our case, we don't.
So we have a wonderful Friends organization in New Orleans, the Friends of the Cabildo, and they have a really robust training system for the 1850 house and the Cabildo and those tours. And I mean, honestly, it's that the training, they're trained to meet the challenges of different questions and dialogue that they will have. And they understand that it's an inclusive and evidence-based history that covers multiple perspectives. And because we have so many different voices that are literally represented in the space, it helps with that docent program and people understanding the points of view and the understanding the full life of the people who live. So, you know, we have an evolving model of once we know better, we do better. If we have new information that we find relevant to our tours, we include that in updates. But you know, you also get into this is our scripts and this is how we do it. And sometimes we'll use programming to kind of interject new perspectives, new discoveries that we've had. Sometimes we'll do it through events. Sometimes we'll do it through our tours. So, you know, we have this information. We have a burning desire to get it to all of our viewers. And so we do that in whatever way we possibly can.
So I just want to mention that when we began to use Lives Bound Together, the exhibit, to really ramp up our interpretation in the historic area, the biggest challenge, we have a core of right now about 60 paid interpreters. And many of them have been at it for many years. The biggest challenge was to get them to be comfortable talking about the topic of slavery and the enslaved people. And one of the techniques and the two key factors we found were competence and confidence, wanting them to have accurate information, and then again, being comfortable to talk about that. And one of the key structures that we used was to create monthly huddles, we called them, to invite all the people who were doing the enslaved community tour and were interested in the topic to gather and talk about how it was going, share information, share reactions, share questions that they had gotten. And it was a slow process, but over time, it has really helped people be comfortable and support each other in engaging with what for many was a difficult topic.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I know I have definitely used Mount Vernon information in one of my tour assignment training programs, but yeah, that's a very difficult tour. You get questions. You have to be, so there's a lot of training you have to read and just know your stuff and keep educating. And if you don't know the answer to a question, you know, but let's go move on. Let's see. The next question that we have are inclusive narratives predominantly featured as temporary exhibitions are separate from the main tour, or have they been integrated into the main narrative of the site? That's from Mary Booth.
I think if I could just I'll kick it off. I think for some of our sites, temporary exhibitions or temporary or special programs are a great way, for lack of a better word, to practice the new narrative, you know, to kind of float it into the community and get feedback on whether we were using the right language or we're telling the right story. And then from there, it gets incorporated into the general interpretive experience. So we definitely do. Plus, you know, as Rob said, you want people to find a reason to come back. So having those special story moments is a great way to do that as well.
Yeah, we are very fortunate that we have so much real estate. And so we try to make sure that everyone is represented in a very broad and general sense. So sometimes we'll focus on populations in Louisiana that that not a lot of people know exists, like the descendants of the Canary Islands who came and populated areas of Louisiana. And that information is often brought back into our permanent spaces so that we have a richer interpretation. I like to view museums as a giant sand garden where you're constantly raking and toiling and changing, and then sometimes you wipe it clean and start over, and sometimes you just build on what you already have. So we take a very active view of our history interpretation and understand that we are making history right now, and that the narrative doesn't work if we don't feel connected to it.
And so I would say for Mount Vernon, the answer to that is really yes and yes. We have focused on the topic of the enslaved people in the exhibition and our museum galleries. But in point of fact, about 20% of our total audience goes into the museum galleries. 98 or 99%, goes to the historic area. That other 1%, maybe just the gift shop. Almost everybody goes in the historic area and the mansion. And it's very important that we have this concentrated place where you can really delve deeply into the history of the enslaved. But there were also very much focused on incorporating that information into our general programming. So, for example, now when you come into the visitor center, we have 2 maps of the estate. There's the standard guide to the estate, which includes a number of sites about the enslaved people. But then there is effectively a self-guided special subject tour that provides more in-depth information on those sites. So again, a way of really letting people know all the resources that are there. And the other important piece of it is getting information out on our website, particularly in this year of COVID. If you do a search for a slavery on our website, I got something like 35,000 hits. Now, I'm sure there's duplication, but the point is there's a lot of information available, even for those who can't come physically to Mount Vernon.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So I want to thank our panelists for joining us for this critical conversations. This is going to conclude our event. Thank you so much for your contributions, and you guys have a great day. Thank you so much. This has been just a great learning experience, and I'm very excited to talk with you guys and nerd out, and just thank you so much. So
thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. It's been a pleasure to be in conversation with everyone.
Thank you.
And thank you to the audience who's joined us today.
Absolutely. You guys are wonderful. Thank you. And thank you, Monique.
oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yay,
I just can't wait
Monique.
to go hop around when COVID ends and just.
Yes, absolutely. We need to see more of you in Baton Rouge.
Yes.
A reason to come to Louisiana and Mount Vernon and
Yes.
take your pick of the National Trust sites. They're all over.
Yes.
Exactly. Can we get a grant for that? Can we get a grant to go around for all that?
I'm okay with that.
Travel?
Who do we sign up with?
Yeah, right, Carrie? You guys got all the money, right?
I did go to one in Liverpool that was awesome about the transatlantic slave trade, and that was awesome. That was amazing. Oh, great interpretation. Okay, but that's it.
All right.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Carrie.
Bye-bye.